a wilderness, in contrast with those areas where man and his works dominate the landscape, is hereby recognized as an area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man, where man himself is a visitor who does not remain. From the great bluffs of Lake Superior to the timber-rich forests in the north, Minnesota is known for its resources and beauty. Tallying over 10,000 lakes, the crystal clear water, along with the abundant wildlife, are staples of the Minnesotan outdoors. This landscape is not only seen for its beauty and recreation, but also as a land filled with natural resources. Being the largest supplier of iron ore and taconite to the United States, as well as ranked 10th in the nation in forest product manufacturing, its terrain has contributed greatly to the economic growth of the nation. In 1902, 500,000 acres of public land were set aside by the U.S. General Land Office as a forest reserve in northern Minnesota. In 1905, another 141,000 acres were added. Together, these lands became the Superior National Forest. In 1926, the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture designated 3 roadless areas in the Superior National Forest. In 1958, the U.S. Forest Service changed the name of the Superior Roadless Primitive Area to the Boundary Waters Canoe Area. In the spring of 1964, concerns about the destruction of the BWCA began to arise. A group known as the Conservation Affiliates from Minneapolis and St. Paul, Minnesota, asked the United States Secretary of Agriculture, Orville Freeman, to stop logging and stop the use of motor vehicles in the Boundary Waters. In September of 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Wilderness Act. This act was created in order to preserve and protect certain lands in their natural condition.
The principal effect of the legislation will be to solidify the present wilderness areas under law rather than under administrative regulation.
In Minnesota, this established the Boundary Waters Canoe Area as part of the new National Wilderness Preservation System and designated it as an instant wilderness. A clause in the act allowed some logging and motor use within the wilderness to continue. Environmentalists believed that this would encourage further destruction of the boundary waters, so the debate continued. In 1978, Congress enacted the BWCA Wilderness Act. The new legislation ended logging, snowmobiling, restricted mining, and confined motorboat use to a small area in the wilderness. Years of debate preceded the bill, and years of debate followed. One of the first controversies in the Boundary Waters took place 30 years prior. It was due to the number of wilderness resorts in the area. Despite the limited access, resort owners flew in guests and supplies by floatplanes. By 1948, a total of 41 resorts were built inside the BWCA. In early 1949, Ely, Minnesota was the largest freshwater seaplane base on the continent. The region was heavy on tourism and is still the most heavily used wilderness area in the nation today, bringing in about 250,000 visitors annually. The resorts began to decline in 1949 when President Truman established an airspace reservation over the BWCA by executive order. This reservation prohibited seaplanes landings in the BWCA and prompted landowners to consider putting their land up for sale. Section 5A of the 1978 Act declared that some resorts and commercial operations inside the BWCA may be required to sell their land to the federal government. Many resort owners were forced out of their own land and lost their livelihoods. The issue of government seizing land in the 1978 Act made many locals very unhappy.
When I was a junior, there was lakes that you could go duck hunting in because the BWCA wasn't kicked in yet. But the following year, all of those lakes were off limits to any of that kind of activity because it was now the BWCA. So one day you could use these lakes, one day you couldn't.
Landowners were not the only people affected by the 1978 legislation. Loggers had been cutting down trees in the area of the BWCA since the 1890s. By the 1930s, almost 25% of the area had been harvested for lumber. The method of harvest was to clear-cut the tracks and haul the logs out by truck. In 1948, 362,000 acres were designated as no-cut zones, as well as a 100-foot strip of land surrounding every body of water. At this same time, from 1948 to 1972, another quarter of the BWCA was logged. Conflicts over logging increased as clear-cutting neared canoe routes. Concerns about the impact that logging was having on the BWCA became a rallying point for environmentalists across the nation.
Anytime you cut down trees, you loosen up the soil, and when it rains, you can have runoff of sediment, dirt, whatever into the water, which can make the water cloudier, can heat up the water. It can change the amount of oxygen in the water, and all those fish that live there that people go up there to fish for can struggle to survive.
At the same time that environmentalists were fighting to ban logging in the BWCA, logging families in the area were concerned that the government would eliminate their jobs and source of income. The harsh reality of losing work, as well as the debate between environmental effects of logging in the area, contributed greatly to the gridlock of the 1978 legislation. The effects of this act shaped the logging industry of Minnesota and can still be seen today.
As far as where the mills are set up in the area, it is more of Bemidji or kind of Duluth, Grand Rapids, kind of moved. It is further away, and there's definitely a huge abundance of timber up there. It would have made sense to have a mill up that way.
Another issue the 1978 Act addressed was the use of motorboats. In the 1940s and 50s, new improvements to boats and camping equipment allowed people to travel further into the BWCA. This sparked conflict as canoeists became annoyed with the sound and carelessness of boat drivers. Many people believed that the use of boats diminished the purpose of the BWCA and hurt the waters they were trying to protect.
When you run a motor on a lake, it's leaking oil sometimes, right? It's leaking gas and oil and other things that a motor can leak. And then that sits on the top, and it's a toxic material for the organisms in the water. But also the noise, because people go to the boundary waters for fishing, for camping, and to get away from all the noise of civilization and society. And I think that changes the experience pretty significantly.
Motorboat users believed that they had a right to share the water with canoeists. They also believed that without the use of their boats, they would no longer have access to the lakes they had always traveled to.
They created this area, but it's only accessible to really a small cross-section of people. If you are old and you can't paddle a canoe or row a boat, it has no value. You can't see that area. If you're handicapped, is it very handicapped accessible? Or is it a land that's really just accessible to a small cross-section of people who can actually do those things?
The issue of accessibility to the elderly and handicapped inspired a provision in the 1978 Act. This called for the creation of campsites outside the BWCA which are accessible by motorboat but still mimic a wilderness experience. The final act created horsepower limits for motors on different lakes and eventually created a plan to phase out the use almost entirely. Mining was the final major issue the 1978 Act addressed. Miners had been digging in the area since the 1800s. In 1966, the federal government issued 2 leases for copper mining in the Superior National Forest around the BWCA. Conservationist Bud Heiselman was one of the most influential voices in this fight to protect the boundary waters. In a public meeting held in Minneapolis in 1974, Bud voiced his concerns about copper mining near the BWCA.
As you may know, copper is one of the heavy metals that's extremely toxic in aquatic ecosystems. 30 parts per billion is toxic to the reproduction of some species of fish, according to work in our Duluth EPA laboratory.
The BWCA Act of 1978 banned mining inside the boundary waters, but not in the surrounding areas. This allowed for companies to mine within close proximity of the protected area, which would interfere with the watershed and contaminate the boundary waters. This issue is still a fiercely debated topic today. Throughout history, policymakers played a critical role providing diplomacy in the midst of the years of debates between the environmentalists, loggers, outdoorsmen, and miners. In 1975, Representative Jim Oberstar proposed a bill to split the boundary waters. Half would be full wilderness, and the other half would stay open to logging and boating. In 1976, Representative Donald Fraser called for an end to logging, mining, and motorboat use in all of the boundary waters. These bills required 2 U.S. congressional hearings, and people from both sides of the argument packed the courtrooms. As a result of these hearings, in March of 1978, Philip Burton and Bruce Vento crafted a 3rd bill. It continued to stall until environmental attorney Chuck Dayton and Ely City attorney Ron Walls produced a compromise proposal known as the Dayton-Walls Agreement. This agreement banned logging and confined motorboat use to a small area. 6 days later, Jimmy Carter signed into law the BWCA Wilderness Act. After years of debate, diplomacy was finally reached.